Hello, everyone. Welcome to EMD Media Show, the H panel. The H panel is on Sundays at this time, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. That will be 4 p.m. Pacific Time. Today, we'll be talking about will Ethiopia evade international accountability? Actually, a viewer already answered saying yes, because Ethiopia haven't committed anything wrong. So we'll hear what the panelists have to say on this topic. And it's my great pleasure today to be joined by Duke Burbridge, Faisal Robla, Solomon Mazgavo. You have seen him before. I just saw Iskiel joining us as well. I think it again disconnected, but Iskiel is also joining in. Welcome, gentlemen. It's great to have you back.
Thank you for having us.
Great. So we will start with the usual question. Before that, I just want to again tell our viewers we are talking about will Ethiopia evade international accountability. This is in relation to what Deputy Prime Minister Dammeka Mokonnin said just last week at the opening of the 42nd, I believe, the ordinary session of the African Union Commission. So let's hear what Dammeka has to say in that meeting.
Unwarranted political pressure from some members of the Council. They succeeded in establishing the International Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia. This commission was established while the government was undertaking accountability measures. The government has accepted the recommendations made by the joint investigation of the Ethiopian Human Rights Council and the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. It has established the Interministerial Task Force to oversee the implementation of these recommendations. The government has taken various accountability measures through the task force. The Commission disregarded these initiatives. It produced a flawed and politically motivated report. To our regret, the Human Rights Council extended the mandate of this commission for an additional period of 1 year, despite opposition from the African members of the Council. This commission could undermine the EU-led peace process and the implementation of the peace agreement with inflammatory rhetoric. It could also undermine the effort of national institutions. Ethiopia upholds its international obligations. In opposing the mandate of this commission, it is not evading its responsibilities. It will ensure accountability for every alleged violation of human rights. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Ethiopia also seeks your support on another important issue of concern. The African Commission on Human and People's Rights established a unilaterally inquiry commission. The commission made this decision irrespective of the government's invitation for a joint investigation with our national institution. We went ahead and conducted a joint investigation with the UN Human Rights and have been implementing recommendations of the joint investigation as I described it previously. The government has also initiated an inclusive national consultation on the transitional justice mechanism as per the peace agreement and the ongoing accountability measures. Ethiopia regrets the establishment of the Inquiry Commission. The African Commission must not undermine the EU-led peace process, the peace agreement, and its full implementation. The Commission must have a principled engagement with its member states in discharging its function. It must stop its consideration to undertake a unilateral investigation irrespective of ongoing national efforts.
Okay, so in that speech, actually, he also mentioned about a second initiative by the African Union Commission itself. So he's saying, speaking again as two commissions, one by at the UN level, another at the African Union level. So we'll talk about that shortly, but let's start with the usual ritual, the what stood out for each panelist. So let's start with Duke. Duke, what stood out for you over the past 7 days?
Well, of course, I look at the humanitarian situation a lot. I follow that very closely, and it seems very obvious that the progress that had been made earlier in opening humanitarian access in Tigray has stalled. In Mekelle, in the central zone, both of those two, there is some improvement. In Mekelle, they're getting pretty regular food distribution. In the central zone, the access has improved. Still not in the areas where Eritrean troops are still there, but the IDPs, the displaced families who are in the population centers of the central zone, are getting more food distribution than they were before, according to the World Food Program. Um, Outside of the central zone, though, everything's going in the wrong direction. In the southern zone, in the southeast zone, even in the northwest zone, food distribution is dipping to very dangerous levels. We're talking about maybe 100,000 people getting food every 6 weeks, which is not something that is able to sustain life until November, which is how long they're going to still need food. Once the lean season starts, when things get a little bit more desperate, they absolutely need to increase the amount of food that's being distributed. They can do this. We've been hearing about food exports out of Ethiopia. Those food should be going to people who need it in Ethiopia. Um, just a couple days ago, there was a convoy, a humanitarian convoy going into Erob, which has been under siege for the past 2 years, that got shot at by what appears to be Eritrean soldiers. This is something that should be investigated. It's very difficult to understand why the United States has taken such a passive posture on this. When did we become the type of country where you can shoot at a truck carrying food to starving people on behalf of the American taxpayer? I don't know, but there's an air of impunity. There's no accountability at the senior levels of the humanitarian response, and it's in free fall right now. It's good that they're getting food out there, and you can see that the 8 week total of food that's getting in is still a lot stronger than it was during the beginning of the year, certainly when the full blockade was on. But this is not enough. It doesn't mean anything to the other 400,000 people in any given zone who aren't getting food, that 100,000 people are getting food. It's good progress, but we're past that point of making progress. Now we're in the point where it's stalled out. We should be scaling up, and right now the progress is stalling. So I'm watching that very closely. Unfortunately, the data is not very good anymore because we have no idea how many displaced families are in population zones in the central zone, in the northwest zone, particularly, also in some of the places closer to the capital, because there hasn't been a IDP assessment released in 16 months. So the data is getting very bad. There's not a lot of accountability, and everybody in the senior leadership in the United States surrounding the peace process seems to be congratulating themselves still. They started celebrating the opening of supply routes into Tigray about 2 weeks before it actually happened, and they're still celebrating it even after progress is stalled. Less than 8,000 people got food in the Northwest Zone. 1 million people need food. Less than 8,000 people got it last week. This is inexplicable. There are 4 functional supply lines in the corridors into the Northwest Zone. There's evidently, according to the World Food Program, there's no restrictions on fuel. So why are people not getting food? Why is this happening? They've completely stonewalled any sort of acknowledgement of failure, any sort of acknowledgement that things aren't going as well as they should be going, and they're celebrating whatever successes they can. And it's just it's very sad because the people who are going to be paying the price for their optimism are starving families who've done nothing wrong and have lived for 2 years of siege warfare. They're the ones that's paying the price. So those are the things that stuck out to me last week and pretty much every week for the past couple of years.
Mm. Thank you, Duke, for that. And it's very important that you always highlight those who are not following Duke. Please follow him on Twitter. He keeps a close eye, I must say, on the humanitarian aspect in the Tigray region. Faisal, what about you? What stood out for you over the past 7 days? Actually, we didn't see each other for 3 weeks now.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think what stood out for me is the renewed conflict taking place in Somaliland. As you know, that Somaliland is officially part of Somalia, but it claims that it has seceded. And the eastern wing of Somaliland is Sol region, central city being Lasaanod. This picture you see is in the square of that city, Lasaanod, which does not agree with Somaliland or Hargeisa, if you will, and its decision to secede from the rest of Somalia. The Somaliland is what was called British Somaliland. It united in 1960, July 1st, with Somalia. Interestingly enough, there is only 4 days difference. Somaliland got out of the hand of British in June 26th, Somali Italian in July 1st, and July 1st they get united. And just what's very interesting was there was a proposal that came to the table for the unification, and it read at the time, and I will quote, Section 1A stated that, in quotes, the state of Somaliland and the state of Somalia do hereby unite and shall forever remain united in a new independent democratic unitary republic. The name whereof shall be called the Somali Republic. That phrase kind of now became a contentious point because Somaliland says, well, we retracted from the union, and Somalia says, no, you cannot unilaterally retract. So the situation you have is a unilaterally seceded region from the mother Somalia, and that unilaterally seceded region is also having its own eastern portion to say they are seceding, which is where the conflict has been happening within the last 4 weeks. And this conflict happened fast and quick. Late December, some prominent people who represented this eastern wing of Somaliland met in Jijiga. Some say President Mustafa Umar of Somali region invited them to just create a narrative because he was having some political issue at the time. Others say, no, he did not. Nonetheless, from that day on, the movement of the people of Lasa Anod took a shape. And all the elders and leaders from that region went to the city, and they literally said to Somaliland, we've been sitting with you for 30 years. We've been voicing our voice not to go with you. We are remaining part of Somalia, and you cannot force us. And Somaliland said, no, you cannot. And then they started bombing the city. And as this article shows, I think at the time this article was written, it says 60,000 of people from Ras Anod went as refugees to the side of Ethiopia. Another 100,000 people are being displaced, and they are just hovering around the small villages within that, close to 200,000, and from a small geography. Literally, what Somaliland is doing exactly what Ethiopia did. It literally created a mini siege around Ras Anod, and people are having issues, not to mention the fact that Somaliland troops are purposely bombarding the city where all the elders are, where the children are. The city has been devastated and literally being destroyed. Quite interestingly, how history repeats itself. The current president of Somaliland, Mr. Musa Bihi, 30 years ago was a rebel fighting and carrying a shoulder, because prior to that he was a colonel in Ziad Barre's army. Today, the people who are opposing him are doing the same thing that he did 30 years ago. He's calling them tribally charged rebellious group, and he has to do what we have heard in Ethiopia, law and order. But let me just again quote you from an article that I wrote in 2007 on the Horn of Africa Journal, where Daniel Companion, who is an African specialist, was traveling with the current president of Somalia, Somaliland's rebel group, city by city, town by town. And Daniel Companion, who is a French scholar, was comparing and contrasting EPLF and the Somaliland's rebel group called at the time Somali National Movement, SNM, where Musa Bihi, this president, was a prominent colonel leading the rebel group. He said, and this is Daniel Companion, who offers an intimate account of the SNM militia in the 1980s, calls them an angry tribesmen who were often agitated by their leaders on the notion that they were fighting imaginary enemy tribe. And he mentions the tribe's name, which is the Ziad Barre's tribe's name. Imaginary forces. Their leader is on the notion that they were fighting imaginary forces, and the other, the Musa's President Musa Bihi's group, will tell the crowds that the enemy should be wiped out, and then they agitate, and people will literally come in droves without having even weapons or anything. Exactly in Las Anod, what's happening is the same slogans and the same rhetoric that the SNM used by invoking the tribal feelings of the people who are, as part of their supporters. So sadly, what had happened 30 years ago, from the point of view of the leaders, from the point of view of the agitations, from the point of view of the political rhetoric, is being now used by the other side who is fighting, who was yesterday's rebel groups. This is a very, very familiar subject that we know in the Horn of Africa. Yesterday's rebel becomes the ruler, and the ruler becomes, the one who is killing and doing the damage. What's quite interesting with the Somalis, which is where it's different from, in the Somali case, usually the elders play a significant role. Probably that's also true in many African societies. While President Musa Bihi has been adamantly opposed to any form of cessation of hostilities and reconciliation and talks, and says, I'm a republic, although the world has not given any single recognition from any country or from UN for whatever. Part of his clansmen, the two major clansmen that occupy Somaliland, today one portion of them organized and said, President, we are no longer with you. We don't condone what you are doing in Las Anod. We don't condone the damage you are causing. We can no longer watch when you are killing and bombarding civilians. Therefore, we are initiating our own reconciliation with our brethren in defiance of you and your government. And they organized 20 plus semi-elderly men who will be traveling to Las Anod, appeal to people to stop the war. And basically, quite interestingly, the 5 points or so points that they drew as part of the appeal to President Musa Bihi and to everybody mimic some of the issues that we have been, saying in Twitter or whatever. Take the troops, remove the troops from population centers, do unilateral but observe ceasefire, take the siege out, start peaceful talking. He refused, but these elders defied him, and now they are on the driver's seat. And I think the world is listening. The U.S. Embassy in Somalia is listening. Other AU and everybody is listening, and EU. And therefore, President Musa Bihi may not be having a luck to continue bombarding. And we hope that this mayhem will come to a quicker end than what had happened in Ethiopia. We don't want to see the same what had happened in Tigray to be happening in Las Anod or in parts of Somaliland. And we appeal even to Musa Bihi, as I tweeted this morning, to learn lessons from Ethiopia and from Tigray, and immediately accept the elderly's call and implement a ceasefire and cessation of hostilities and initiate peace talks. That's what stood up for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Faisal. I don't think Solomon's video is working. Azgal, I'm glad you made it. For our viewers, I was saying that you are on the road. Actually, it's most often than not. More often than not, Azgal is on the road, and he joins us maybe after an end of one road trip or between two road trips and so on. So I'm glad you could make it. So what stood out for you? It's great to have you back.
Thank you. There isn't a single event that stood out for me this week. What I was observing from a series of actions by the Ethiopian government that passes for governing, I was noticing or observing a pattern that adds up to something conceptual, at least in my mind. Let me start with the most recent action, and that is the announcement by the government, the regional government of Oromia, that the Oromia government is holding up the olive branch to the rebels or the OLA, but not even mentioning the appropriate name of the OLA. He calls them Shani. There is no organization in Oromia that is fighting. It's no armed group that is called Shani, but it's a phantom organization that the Oromia regional government had created. But the president addressing the parliament, the regional parliament, he said that the government of the regional government is ready to reconcile itself with the armed groups that are roaming around in the regional, in the Oromia region. And he asked many of the fighters to return home, to put their arms down and then return home. Now, to be serious about it, the conflict is not between the Oromia government and the OLA or the Oromo Liberation Army. The conflict is basically between the federal government and the OLA. What people were talking about was that it is time for Ethiopia to build on the peace that was negotiated, that ended the war in Tigray through negotiations, to continue along that path and begin negotiations with the OLA. The pressure was mounting. I have some information that even from the top levels of the American government, that pressure was being applied. From the Europeans through the Norwegians, that pressure was being applied. So what the Ethiopian government did, or what the prime minister did, was subcontract the idea of negotiating with OLA to the regional government, which is not officially in basically leading the war against the OLA. What I was trying to say about that is that the government of Ethiopia is not serious about doing what in Oromia, what it had achieved in Tigray. It's not serious about the negotiated end to the conflict in Oromia, but they are just playing a public relations drama. That's the first thing. Second is the negotiations between the breakaway Orthodox archbishops of Oromia and the nationalities, and the Orthodox Church, which was the existing Holy Synod. To my understanding, and from the information that I have, the Prime Minister knows this. Maybe he actually initiated it because he needed a crisis to resolve. When the crisis broke out, he came on television and speaking to his ministers, told them that what appeared that he was siding with the Oromia and the nationalities synod, saying that he's not in any position to tell them not to be able to use their own language in worshiping their God. That way, he appeared to be on the side of the Oromia Senate. But when he assembled them, he recorded. He recorded what was going on. The negotiations were recorded, probably unbeknownst to the negotiators on both sides. But in what is being recorded, he was admonishing basically the Oromia side for basically saying you're demanding something that has already been agreed to. So when the conflict begins, he seems to be siding with the Oromia side, but with the recorded negotiations, he seemed to be berating the Oromia side. So he's on both sides on television. But what he was doing is to precipitate a crisis, seemed to be siding on one or the other side, warn everybody else not to insert themselves into this conflict, and then he comes out as the peacemaker between the two. So that is basically what he engineered, and then came out as if he is the peacemaker, showing to Ethiopians and the rest of the world that had he not been in that position, had he not been the prime minister, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church could have split and maybe could have led to a conflict. That is the second public relations exercise. And the third one is the export of wheat. We know that Ethiopia is not food self-sufficient. We know that Ethiopia is not able to export wheat whatsoever because they have been receiving three shiploads of wheat from Ukraine. We know that the World Food Program has been helping Ethiopia. We know that there is food shortage in the south, there is drought in the south and the southeast. We know all of that. But in all of that, it doesn't matter. What matters is that there is a headline in Ethiopia that says that Ethiopia for the first time was able to export wheat to abroad. What the pattern is, it's not that things are happening. It's the fact that the Ethiopian Prime Minister really uses every occasion for a public relations stunt. What is the pattern showing me? Well, I've heard about the rule of law before, and I've heard about the rule of violence. I have not heard before the rule of public relations. Basically, that's what is being done, and Ethiopia is left ungoverned. Ethiopia is not being governed. And the problem that you see in Somalia or elsewhere, well, this was supposed to be the anchor state. And when the anchor state is engaged in the rule of public relations and not seriously governing the country, I think the instability that you see everywhere is probably emanating from the weakness in Addis Ababa. So that is basically the pattern that stood out to me today, this week.
I think all these topics are worth, 3-4 shows on their own right. It's a very multiple things happening at the same time. Dr. Solomon Mazgabo, I don't know if you can hear me. Your video is still frozen, but if we can hear you, maybe if you can try to share with us what was the highlight for you in terms of the past week.
Is it frozen for you, Duke, Scale?
It seems frozen.
It seems
I
frozen?
can hear you. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Let me turn off the video and just focus on the audio then. Thank you for having me, Getachew.
So I think it's good to turn on the video because at least we can see one frozen image. That's better.
Okay. That's fine.
Okay, go ahead now.
Okay. It's a bit challenging being the last speaker when such notable speakers covered very important and pressing matters. I think it's a sad note that if it's not Tigray, it's Oromia. If it's not Oromia, it's Somaliland. If it's not Somaliland, it's Somalia. The Horn continues to be a center of some kind of quagmire, and mostly by politicians even on self-inflicted things that they have brought this disaster and instability in the region. The food distribution, particularly humanitarian assistance, and delivery and distribution in Tigray, which Duke elaborated, is a very sad record, particularly for the US government. We had recently a briefing from Ambassador Mike Hammer, who seemed to report very encouraging or uplifting humanitarian assistance delivery and distribution. And when we call our family members, the story is completely different. I mean, I can give you many examples, and every diaspora member can give you a lot of concrete examples. But I'll give you two. So we call someone in Samra, and which is about 35 miles south of Magala, very accessible. In the last 4 months, I think they had one or twice of humanitarian assistance distribution. And we are talking about something around 10, 12 pounds. In Adwa, what they have seen so far is a one-time distribution of about 10 to 12 pounds. So even those reached in 4 months, or for that matter, in a couple of years, we are talking about 10 pounds of wheat, grain, or whatever they got. So it's very, very sad. But what was promised in the Pretoria, and what U.S. diplomats and including World Food Program and other UN officials have been trying to share with the public a positive image, that an immediate resumption of commerce, trade, movement of goods, which is not happening. Actually, before the war, before the Pretoria Agreement, particularly during the intense war, there was intense effort to open a corridor, humanitarian assistance corridor, and every time convoys were frustrated in the process, you would hear a report on it, that the humanitarian assistance is not going, particularly between Samara and Maqala. All that paths have been monitored and was reported. Not as much as we would like to, but at least there was regular reports on it. What's surprising now, after the peace agreement, when you would expect a tremendous movement of goods, but particularly humanitarian assistance mobilization, not only slowed down, but when there are stumbling blocks, particularly on the southwestern corridor between Dawarak and Mbadra, there are so many blocks the Amhara Fano and others have put in place, but nobody is willing to report on that. The US government knows that, but they don't want to say that. On humanitarian assistance, particularly emergency assistance for critical healthcare need, that the healthcare facilities, particularly the one in Magala, either the major referral hospital needs, they have literally nothing. Nothing is coming. And what is very frustrating, astonishing, is the medical staff have been instructed not to report on this, not to say a word about it. This is a directive from the federal government and from the party on Tigray who signed on the Pretoria Agreement. It's very frustrating. And that to paint a color that everything is hunky-dory and dandy by US government and others is very sad. Coming back to the topic, it gives this arrogance and emboldened the Mecca Abbey to come forward in front of the regional body, AU, to demand even the modicum of investigation. Not referral to Hague, but the modicum of just the investigation part. This is how arrogant they became. And that shows a complacency and turning blind eye from the international community when they should put pressure because they don't have excuse. If there was warring parties, if there was violence and conflict, you can say I was not responsible or something. They can come all kind of excuse, which they did. Now what excuses do they have? They have nothing. And yet They continue to use humanitarian assistance, food, commerce to exercise as a feature of subjugation. That's what they're doing.
Thank you. Actually, we could see your video as well. So there was a Europe viewer reporting that there was nothing delivered in Europe as well. Even the war is not over Europe. Europe is in Eastern Tigray, a minority group that has actually suffered a lot, even since the Ethio-Eritrean war and during that time, and continues to do that. Gentlemen, thanks for this great opening. Let's go to the topic. Will Ethiopia evade international accountability? The first question I want to ask everyone, and if you can be brief on that so that we cover the whole session, is what's your assessment of what Jamaica, the Deputy Prime Minister, said in that video? And this is not new. We have discussed at least once or twice on this topic before as well. But given that Ethiopia is pushing hard again in yet another effort to stop international accountability, how should we read? How should the international community, how should our viewers understand that? Let's start with Faisal.
Yeah. Well, I think Ethiopia is very clear in its stand to say we don't want any international organization, be that UN or otherwise, to play a role in this investigation, period. And I think, can Ethiopia evade? Probably it will at the larger scale. When I say probably it would evade the investigation at the larger scale, they could probably escape from a very serious, presentation of Ethiopia's crimes in Tigray, and not even to mention in Oromia and elsewhere. Simply because Abiy has been resuscitated, revived, he has been rehabilitated. Yesterday at the AU, you could see him hugging and kissing the United Nations General Secretary. You could see him showing triumphalist attitude, and basically, it's Ethiopia is sending the message, really the subliminal message, in my opinion, that it's only the Europeans and the Westerner white imperialists who are pushing this. Tigray is not pushing. TPLF is not pushing. The people whom we had the conflict is not pushing. It's a family conflict. We will take care of this in the same way that we take care of our own family issues. But please stay away. We're an African nation. We're a big African nation. We have all the support of the AU, and AU can collaborate with us on what to do. But as far as donors and Europeans and United Nations and the US is concerned, but we will not accept you. And I think this is really, again, Ethiopia showing complete but confident defiance. In Somali, there's a proverb that says, kill the enemy, but also give them their credit. I give Ethiopia, particularly Abiy and his team, the negative credit that they are showing the world that they can withstand, in quote unquote, in their opinion, imperialists. When they want to push them, they can also bring in-house imperialists when they need their hand and their aid and their money and their food aid. And basically, that's the message Ethiopia is sending. And in my opinion, maybe somewhere, I cannot tell when, a little slap on the wrist, some face saving could be done here and there. But what the people who were involved in the war, survivors of the victims, may never see justice in this case, from what I glean. I could be wrong, but I said always that you should never depend on US and the West, because these are people through memory who have sustained dictators like Idi Amin, like Mobutu Seko, like the Filipinos, Marcos. America doesn't feel guilty when average people are killed or wiped. America feels notice when nation is whom it wants to have relationship, diplomatic relationship with, it starts pressuring and demanding, and then that's where the compromise comes. So I think that both the US and EU, as well as the United Nations, as you see here, this cozy relationship or conversation, I think Abiy and Ethiopia will evade the big picture of the crime, mainly because of the two hands. TPLF will be quiet. They will never raise the issue. And then the international world will give Ethiopia a pass to go to the next phase, which is to run this country. And, somebody may, small people may here and there shout or take their cases to certain courts when it comes to America, and families of Tigrayans who are American citizens can do here and there, but the big picture is already lost, and they evaded that. Thank you.
Thank you, Faisal, for that. Zgel, I want to come to you, and you talked about how Abiy, who is clearly from our sources as well behind the crisis in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church vis-a-vis Oromia and nations and nationalities, the Holy Synod, but he appeared finally when he saw the pressure, the one who is making peace. So is Ethiopia's status at the seat of the African Union, as all this, giant with over 120 million people, is it weaponized? Is that status weaponized to the extent of like evading international accountability, appearing whenever he wants, the way he wants, in terms of domestic PR as well? So what is your reading again in terms of what's happening here vis-a-vis Tigray and what he's trying to do in other areas as well? Scale.
I think what needs to be posited first of all, whether Ethiopia can evade international pressure or international demands for accountability or not, is what Ethiopia is accused of. That's important to repeat it. I think Ethiopia is today led by a person who is accused of committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, possibly genocide against Tigray or the people of Tigray, and similar crimes in Oromia and in Benishangul region and against the Command people in the Amhara region. Same war had been waged against the Oromo in the Amhara region, displacement, burning villages and homes in cities in the Oromia region. And in these regions and all over the country, the regime has committed dehumanizing atrocity crimes, the evidence of which are almost uncontestable. There is compelling evidence that Abiy and his regime had committed all of the crimes I just listed. This is also a prime minister who is accused of treason by some for inviting foreign forces to mercilessly annihilate his own compatriots. That's the accusation. I think it's going to be very difficult for the rest of the world to simply look away from genocide. It's going to be very difficult for them. But the Ethiopian government is worried about this, and that's why he is calling people in Tigray and other places to stand against the investigation by the international experts of human rights. He wants to avoid it because if this goes on, maybe the rest of the world could look away, but the international committee of experts is probably going to do whatever it takes to dig out evidence on the alleged atrocity crimes of various kinds that his regime has committed. If that comes out, if it really comes out that the evidence becomes compelling, it's going to be very difficult, especially for the Europeans. I know they want to look away from that. They want to look away. They want to prop him. They think that in his absence, and this is how he has presented himself, that if Abiy Ahmed is not on the throne in Ethiopia, I think that's the way they have started to probably mistakenly refer to him as His Imperial Majesty. If he's not on the throne, that Ethiopia will disintegrate. If Ethiopia disintegrates, the rest of the Horn of Africa is going to go. It's going to go awry. Because they are spooked by this prospect, I know they are committed to trying to maintain him, sustain him in power. If the evidence comes out, it's going to become very difficult for them to continue to support a man who is accused of genocide. It's going to be very difficult. So they're trying to bury it. But why is Ethiopia trying to avoid accountability? Because the crimes are real. And if the evidence comes out, you will be accountable. That Ethiopia is going to be, as it is right in my mind, led by a man who had authorized genocide or ethnic cleansing or any other of those the crimes that I listed. So he's determined. He's determined to do whatever he can to avoid that accountability, and he's appealing to the African governments that had actually stood with him. It doesn't really matter. They also have their own problems. So if Africa stands with Abiy Ahmed, we have seen it as the crimes were even perpetrated in Tigray and other regions of Ethiopia. The AU stood with him. The chairman stood with him. So he's going to do everything, mobilize any force that he could muster to try to stop it. Because if the evidence comes out, then that is going to be very difficult to continue to defend him. So they might all conspire, all of them might conspire to bury the evidence. But one way or the other, they could postpone it, but it's going to come out. And I think that is what is going on. He would do all kinds of public relations, schmoozing with the UN, the UN Secretary General. He has all of these people, the powers that be on his side. He might be able to avoid accountability, but I think the evidence is for those of us who are watching carefully. The evidence is out there. He really doesn't want another pressure on his government, because this is really a fragile government. I don't want to go into that, but it is a phantom state, as they call it, a phantom state, or a state without administration, because everything that he does is in Addis Ababa. Everywhere else to the west and to the south, it's not clear that the government has any hold on security and the movement of people in those areas. So yeah, he will do everything. He will do everything to try to avoid this accountability, and he's mobilizing his government and his allies to evade accountability.
Thank you, Ezekiel, for that. Solomon, on that same question, but earlier Faisal alluded to the fact that TPLF or Tigray might not even also be part of pressuring for accountability. I think that's some concerns from Tigray as well. We hear that the TPLF might be behind the doors discussing with Abiy on this. The other aspect is as well what the international community said and knew in terms of determination that has been delayed, maybe even pushed out of the table. So how are you reading how the TPLF, which is the parties that signed the agreement in Pretoria, and the follow-up talks in Nairobi as well? So what is your reading of how Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, might be evading accountability, international accountability?
As Scale elaborated very well, and Faisal, the establishment of this commission and the renewal of its mandate happened despite the protests from Ethiopia. It happened despite the support the African Union countries showed supporting Abiy to stop this commission from being formed and from being renewed. So that it's no surprise that they continue to do that. That they come in the middle of the second term so forcefully before its term comes to end shows you something is cooking. That they know there is material, if became public, would be the cat out of the bag. So that's why forcefully they are moving to stop it. Can they stop this? It looks unprecedented, but nothing is impossible. They might. The challenge is for the international, for the commission that's established, without visiting Tigray, without speaking directly to the victims on the ground, only with a fraction, maybe 10% of the document and evidence they need, they have determined war crimes have happened, atrocities have happened, crimes against humanity have happened. There is nothing they can do to burn or bury this. It's out. So they would have difficulty to shelve this and bury it, given Tigray is not the only case in front of them, even though for this commission it is, but for the UN has done more investigations and will come. Russia is going to come, and other countries are going to come. The yardstick to use against one or the other is going to be challenging if you change it like that, in a whim. So they will be on the spotlight. The commission, its members, and the supporters, including European Union, are going to be on the limelight. So there are a lot of ifs. Let's say this, if the commission, through the different pressures, abandonment of support, stops or comes with a lukewarm report. So the very nature, this will refer to the commission, is to seek justice. To seek justice where not only victims get some redress, but the measures would stop the continuation of violence. That's the intent. You go to a judicial system, particularly to international tribunal. If this is shortchanged, if the victims fail to get some form of justice, they will retort to a means of reprisal. They will call for a day. So if this investigation was to go through, the next likely scenario would be mediation, arbitration, compensation. Maybe some authorities may be held responsible, and African Union and others would be called upon. Traditional Tigray, Ethiopia mechanisms would be explored to keep the peace. But if you go this route for temporary reasons, for immediacy, for political expediency, he will be only shooting his feet. Because these are not 10, a couple of hundred, not that any life is less. We are talking about hundreds of thousands, possibly 1 million lives lost, injured, and hurt. They will seek justice. They will find opportune time. And the sad part is, this is not confined to Tigray. This was not a story of yesterday. It is happening in Tigray, but it's also happening in Oromia as we speak, every single day. So it's in its nature, in its character, unless the government reforms itself to redress the injustice, to to resolve conflicts and political differences in a peaceful manner, in a democratic manner, he continues the path he's traveling, he will be just preparing his downfall. So by trying to scuttle the effort of the investigative commission, at the end of the day, he may look for a year, 2, 3 years that he evaded justice. But the reasons the 1974 revolution brought in Ethiopia, the reasons that brought the revolution in 1991 and also drug, are injustices. And that's not only unique to Tigray. It happened in Somalia, it happened in Sudan, it happened everywhere else. It will happen again in Ethiopia. Unfortunately, this will be a cycle of violence. This will just feed a cycle of violence. The international community, European Union, United States, if they participated in the sham way of frustrating and scuttling, they will continue to see weakness and probably even pay the price for the violence and instability in the region.
Thank you, Solomon, for that. Duke, I saw you tweeting about Blinken's tweet on the determination from, I think it's about Russia, where he clearly cites, this may be a different one, where he clearly cites about law and available facts. And he says, I have determined that members of Russia forces and other Russian officials have committed crimes against humanity in Ukraine. And all those responsible for these atrocities must be held accountable. So, I mean, if we were to go back to March 2021, that's where Blinken said, as CNN reported, as it was showing, ethnic cleansing happening in Western Tigray. And this article a year ago, 2 years ago, you're citing them. So what's your reading of what Ethiopia is going after versus what White House and what the Secretary of State might be doing or not doing?
Before Duke says, can I say a prop? They also said in the last couple of days, the White House and State Department, what Russia is doing is against civilization. Continue.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's the thing. Yeah, that would have had to be about Russia, because the Secretary of State doesn't talk that way about Tigray, about Ethiopia. If this was Ethiopia, he'd be talking about both sides have committed terrible crimes. Both sides need to reel it in, but we're not going to talk about this for peace. I mean, the Secretary of State, the Department of State, so far has sort of failed in their obligation to the people of Tigray, and to their obligations to protect human rights to the extent that they can. It's sort of humiliating that the Secretary of State had to come out at a year apart to feign surprise that a new report found that there was ethnic cleansing in Western Tigray, which is, I mean, it's certainly very terrible what's going on there, but this is still a fraction of the type of atrocities that have been committed in Tigray. But this is sort of the pattern that we see from the United States, sort of shake our heads and, make a statement, an equivocal statement, and then move on, and then nothing happens. I think that it is possible that there will be justice for Tigray. I'm a little bit optimistic about it. I know that you would go broke betting on justice for the victims of atrocities like this, but there are some reasons to be optimistic. One of those reasons is that there's been so much documentation. Aside from the Itri Commission, aside from the UN Commission, there's been a number of reports from Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, all of these organizations that are considered fake news by the Ethiopian regime and their supporters, but everybody else around the world looks at them as pretty, prestigious and credible organizations. There's also been a number of media reports. There's also been eyewitness testimony. There's been terrible recordings of horrible crimes against humanity that have taken place. This has been well documented. This is not something that can be ignored forever. I believe that there will be some momentum to get this in front of people a little bit more once it becomes a situation where the United States is not looking at, well, if we acknowledge that this is happening, then there's going to be pressure on us to send troops in or something like that. These were the sorts of arguments they were using against, recognizing the genocide, and those arguments are going to fall away. Another thing is that I think you saw the first comment of the show, the Ethiopian government did nothing wrong. Those voices are going to get a little weak as we go on. They do not have the same drive to see their narrative win as the people who are related to the victims of the horrible atrocities that have been committed in Tigray. They will outlast you. Somebody from Tigray mentioned to me, it took 100 years for Armenia to get the genocide declared, and it's terrible. And I know this has to be frustrating. There's a grave injustice that 100 years ago by, but you also have to flip the script on that and see that 100 years later, there were still people pushing to get the genocide recognized. And that does not bring justice, of course. We've already passed the stage of bringing justice, because when you see it happening, justice is to stop it. When we talk about, are they going to get justice? This is when you find out about something after the fact. We know the Ethiopia Commission, they're trying to shut it down. I don't know if they're going to be able to or not. They failed a couple times to do it. They'll probably fail again. But what is the Ethiopia Commission doing? I read the report. It was as good as it could be without getting access to Tigray, but it was largely based on secondary sources. It was based on investigations that had already happened, and it was an important document because those investigations have been ignored by the UN joint investigation. But they're not breaking any new ground. I'm wondering if the Ethiopian government's heart is really in shutting down the Ethiopia Commission, because I'm not sure what the Ethiopia Commission could do any more than they're already doing to play into the hands of the Prosperity Party. But there is an opportunity to see as close as we're going to find to justice through a recognition of what's happening. There was a book published recently by the former country director of the WFP saying that there were no starvation deaths in Tigray. Well, that's ridiculous. It's ridiculous because we have evidence that there were starvation deaths in Tigray. It's ridiculous because this is not an unknown. This is only an unknown to people who aren't paying attention. And when all of these things come out, when people come out and say there's no starvation deaths, we can say, here's a list of people who starved. Here's a list of hospital wards that were full of starving children. These things are possible to do. It's possible to show that these things happen. This is well documented in a way that wasn't really possible before. No other time has it been so. I mean, they shut down communications, they shut down all these things, but it's just easier now to document things. It's harder to hide what's been going on. And the Ethiopian government has not been doing it very well. They've been incompetent in the cover-up. And that's cost them a great deal. Not as much as you'd hope. I mean, you would hope that if they're not able to cover it up, they'd have to stop. But of course, we don't live in that kind of world. We live in a world that these things can happen in Africa for a very long time before the United States government decides to do anything about it, before the international community decides to care about it. Of course, if it happens to Ukraine, then everybody jumps on it. And God bless them. I mean, please stop what is going on in Ukraine, the suffering that the civilians of Ukraine are going through. My heart is with them. But that can't be the only place. Europe cannot be the only place where we have human rights. It's not something that is sustainable. What is happening, the impunity in Tigray, is indicative of a greater problem with the human rights commitment of the world. When the United States says we believe in human rights, that these things are unacceptable, and the UN says the same thing, and they have their little days about, this is going to be the day to end weaponized starvation while people are being starved. These sorts of things will catch up to them at some point. I don't know if that's going to be soon enough to make a real difference, but I believe that, and particularly with the diaspora, particularly with people still raising their voices about this and who will continue to raise their voices about this, they won't let it die. If it hadn't been for a lot of people talking about this, this would have gone down as the Prosperity Party wipes out a threat. This wouldn't be known as a very, very dirty war that the Prosperity Party has taken out on the people of Tigray in concert with the Eritreans. This is something that is going to come out, and you can see right now when Ethiopian officials are standing in front of the AU talking about an investigation that the AU never took seriously, that they never carried out. They tried to, they made some noise about it. The Abiy told them to stop, and they stopped. But while people are still starving to death, while women are still being violated in Tigray, there's recent reports since the peace process, while people are still being killed, while Erob is still occupied, they're still talking about maybe we should just not let anybody look at human rights violations in Tigray. I don't think it's sustainable. I think that it will be very difficult to do anything about it. But I think that there is a better chance that we're going to see justice in Tigray, as close as we can get to justice, than any other place that I can think of right now. So that's as optimistic as I can be.
Thank you, Duke, for that. I just want to go to, we're running out of time, but before I move to the final thought and a question on specifically, should Tigray, for example, wait and see as it has been doing, specifically those who advocate for human rights, the victims, respective of what's happening between Mekelle and Addis Ababa. So that will be the question that I will be bringing to the panelists. Before that, as we always say, we are live now online, but we are also broadcast on the satellite to the Horn of Africa on HBS. HBS is Horn Broadcasting Services. Those who have been following us, you saw a pinned link at the YouTube channel. So if you go to that link, you will be able to see a number of links. I just want to share with our viewers where you can support our continued presence on satellite as UMD and other medias that share the same satellite. But also a very important aspect of that is the virtual education. In this humanitarian dimension of the war, the genocide, one of the groups that have suffered a lot are children of Tigray. They have been out of school for almost 3 years now. So there is a significant time given, hours given on the satellite from morning to late afternoon. It's on education, virtual education. So you can support that effort by going to the link I pinned on YouTube. If you go up, you should be able to see that. And it will take you to a number of platforms where you can support HBS, Foreign Broadcasting Services, and UMD Media, including this show today, will be broadcasted on that satellite. With that, I just want to come to the final thought. Faisal, what is your final thought, specifically on, you have been insisting consistently, I must say, and rightly so, that we shouldn't wait and see for the US to do something or the Western in general to do something. I think slowly but surely, it looks like that's where we are heading. So what should those who advocate for human rights in Tigray, for accountability in general, we can extend it to Oromia, elsewhere as well, but Tigray, where things have been it was as a kind of a magnet for all these atrocities that we have seen over the past 2 years. So what will be your to-do list in terms of the accountability issue?
Yeah, Getachew. Yeah, I'll come to that. Just one little caveat. I think, my response to questions like this is usually advised by my understanding of the U.S. role in African politics and in African development in the last so many years. Just take an example of the 1970s, the 80s, when TPLF, EPLF were fighting. Imagine if TPLF, EPLF, and for that matter, OLF, Western Somali Liberation Front, uh, expected arbitration from the United States of America, which was at one time a very close ally of Haile Selassie. And imagine yourself appealing to the State Department to hold Haile Selassie responsible for what he has done in the 40s, 50s, 60s. Add to that the role of the US in the world, which has been weakened in the last 3 decades. US foreign policy cannot afford to lose, quote unquote, some countries, no matter what they do, such as Ethiopia, such as Nigeria, because its competition and its margin of error to not win those countries is very small, given the aggressive policies of Russia and China. US has been silent when this war was taking place, when its own allies were arming Addis Ababa, such as the United Arab Emirates, which used to, in the past, just follow step by step with what the US does. This time, they did their own, and the US kept silent. Also, just 10 years ago, a little, back, the 2010, what Letitia of the Human Rights Watch last week in Tigray media, she literally cited how the Somali massacre and atrocities qualifying for war crimes and crimes against humanity. That's what the one that happened between 2008 to 2014. The people who survived those atrocities and crimes are still alive. One of the women that I covered, her throat was slit with wire. They used to cut the throat of human beings, the Ethiopian army, by razor wire. And some of those people survived and went to Kenya. And Jeffrey Gentleman of the New York Times literally documents. So the Somali situation was different than Tigray in the sense that real information was coming on real time, because they can, journalists could come from Kenya, from Somalia. It was a porous, they couldn't put a siege. With all that, today, some of those officers who were implicated, including the former Prime Minister Haile Mariam, did not only escape or evade, he is thriving. He's making millions and millions of dollars, although documentation is all over. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Red Cross, everywhere. And he's thriving, and he's an advisor to Prime Minister Abiy. So with that, combine all this, I think the one factor that's missing is that in the past, people used to have a second option, the guerrilla option, the war option, so that's no longer here. So the government is appealing to establish institutions such as the United States, EU, and United Nations. The victims are also appealing to the same guy, which is those big countries, and they're picking and choosing. At one time, as Duke showed us, there was a time we felt comfortable with Blinken and what's her name, the USA. Yeah, all of them, all of them, including the US Congress, just holding Ethiopia its feet on the fire. Today, when Blinken was asked, he literally said, "Don't ask me those questions. We are engaging Ethiopia. We are engaged." And then last week, I think the spokesperson for the White House literally refused, although the questioner was wrong, but he refused, Dennis, to say anything negative about the Ethiopian government. Now, as you guys said, the UN report may go on. I don't know where it's gonna land. I think I agree with Duke that sometime in the future, 30 years, 40 years, something could happen at an individual level, as I said. Now, let me come back to what the people can do. I think the guerrilla era is no longer working in the African context. And, Somalis cannot go and pick up the arms and fight a behemoth that can use drones and what have you. I think one way to express the victim's feelings is probably, for the lack of a better word, a Gandhi philosophy. People's movements that really, come in sort of like counterbalancing the government narrative, whether those are peaceful demonstrations, adapting the Cairo style, where you literally bring the government to a standstill so it cannot function. While that's one part of the struggle, I think the second part of the struggle should be the diaspora, as Duke said. I think we should never give it up. We should knock every door, because you can tell from the Twitter, even the most active element were the Tigray diaspora. They are quiet because most of them were supporting TPLF TDF. TPLF TDF is quiet, so they are quiet. So what's missing, the vacuum, is people who advocate for human rights and stick to that and say we will never give up until something. Look where we came from. At one point, we were talking the Dayton formula, where people could come and bring the government to account for it. That's no longer there. Then we started to go through the UN, and that's now being diluted. The Mega McConnell is now demanding that they don't want UN or EU, but the Africa Commission, whose result we can project what it will be. It will not even be a wrist, a slap on the wrist. So I think, I don't want to expect a solution or a resolution from the European or the American government, because they will always politicize human rights, and politicization of human rights will end up siding the governments that they need. They need Ethiopia. That's the objective and the reality. They want Abiy with all his baggage, and we shouldn't be in the same, expectation that we were, when it comes to the US and European. I think new strategy should be drafted. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Faisal. Still on the same question.
I guess the same question, my final thought would be, I think the government of Tigray has made a strategic choice, very strategic choice in a very difficult situation. Abiy has promised them to do everything to rehabilitate, reconstruct, and restore Tigray if they agree not to threaten his power. Tigray's leaders have taken him up on his promise and have decided to help the region today, rather than insist on accountability for the victims of Abiy's war on Tigray yesterday. So they've made this probably pragmatic choice. Why cause more people to be killed, demanding for justice, while you can save commission of future crime? It's not really a choice that they made after deliberation, or if they had another choice, they would probably choose on demanding justice. But Tigray is in a conundrum after 800 days of siege, ending the war and restoring Tigray to some kind of semblance of life became necessary. Very bad choice, but probably a pragmatic choice. Now, outsiders, the EU and the United States are probably, and some other countries are the ones that would probably insist on accountability for what had happened. The Horn of Africa is a crucial strategic position, has been so historically for many foreign players, which had deeply influenced local political landscapes in the region. It's all about hydropolitics. That is, at least for Ethiopia, Ethiopia seems to be really at the center of it. It's Nile to the west, the Red Sea to to the northeast, and now emerging is the Indian Ocean blue economy. With its massive population size, demographic size, historical significance, and economic potential, Ethiopia stands out as a leviathan in this hydropolitics, shaping interstate, regional, and global interests in the region. Ethiopia is going to be really the gateway, not only in the Horn, but to the rest of Central Africa. Now, so what is happening to me is that Ethiopia is really becoming a pivotal point of the new great game with capital G and G, driven by security considerations, commercial interest, now playing out in the region and layering new rivalries and ideological quarrels involving the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Turkey and Iran regionally, and China, Japan, Russia, Europe, and the United States globally. There is that new great game of layered competition. In this layered competition, the United States is at a disadvantage. I think the Chinese have made inroads since 1994, the first time that Jiang Zemin visited Africa. The EU is a latecomer to the ongoing scramble for Africa. I do not really think that the United States and the EU are going to lose or cede this region to the Chinese and the Russians and to the regional players who are not necessarily allies of the United States and the EU. So if internally that Tigray is not going to insist on accountability, and if the rest of the world is now engaged in this great game, I don't know if the International Commission of Experts on Human Rights is going to be able to do its job. I think it's going to be thwarted because there is no internal demand for it. There will be no internal demand for it, no insistence internally, and there will be no insistence on it that human rights really is going to take a back seat to the great game. That's what I think.
Thank you for that, Pascal. Solomon, are you with us?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, your video is off though.
I'm sorry, terribly. I don't know what's happening. Has been stable all day. But as long as you can hear me, the audio, let me say a few words.
Okay.
I think who said a week in politics is like a year. You never know what's going to happen. Who would have thought one of the defining moments in force alignment or political alignment would evolve as a result of a CNED. The Oromia CNED has established setting from the Arat Kilo or Addis Ababa Qadis Mariam CNED. There are going to be a lot of developments influencing Ethiopia's political and the region's politics in the future, including what just Faisal shared with us about the southern eastern of Somaliland. So there are, as big as it is, it's not a unified political nation. There are so many moving elements. There are so many dynamics playing out that would influence the direction of the state and the regional stability as well. TPLF, like many regimes, particularly the current leadership, have chosen is working on eggshell and chosen a political expediency of playing it down and playing it quiet. But there is a cost because the constraints are demanding otherwise. They are doing a difficult balance act between maintaining power and legitimacy within their constraints, and between getting the support and the approval they need from Abiy and maintaining that relationship. It is a difficult balance and dance they are doing. The likelihood is the constraints will win, but you never know. We will see. But it's not news that not only in part of our corner, but in the rest of the world, that politicians are transactionals. A good number of them are transactionals, and for political expediency, including issues like war crimes, atrocities, they can bury them under the rug. So we are not shocked. The current PLF leadership is doing that. But there is a price to pay for that. And then the same with Abiy. He started this fire, playing the games between the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, but it backfired. Even though for a week or two, he may be seen by some as a mediator who brought back as a shepherd the lost sheep. But I think the public reaction that we see is outright horror and indignation and dismay at what he did. So this is true to many autocrats. This is not unique to Abiy. They play with fire, even though they can schmooze and somehow pat the international community, EU, US, or others, and UN officials. It's in their DNA that they do create problems because they are not a democratic system. They are autocrats. So they will continue to run into problems. Even though on the larger picture, we see these regional and international forces, politics is local. Like Tip O'Neill used to say, politics is local. And those shape regional, national politics as well. And we will see them playing out. Thank you.
Thank you, Solomon, on that. I will come to Duke on the final thought. I'm showing our viewers this is the global scholars and professionals society, GSTS of Tigray, the largest scholars group, I must say, with over 5,000 scholars as members. And it issued a proposal for formation of the interim government or interim administration in Tigray, where it asked or it proposed a 25, 25, 20, 30 formula. And by that, it's proposing TDF will nominate 25% of those who would make up both the executive body and the legislative body. And TPLF, again, limited to nominating 25%. And the majority of these bodies would be made up of civil society organizations, minorities, associations of various types, and constituencies, communities, and eminent persons. And it's asking even the TDF membership would be free of any political party affiliation, and opposition parties making up 20%. This proposal, 9-page proposal, came out yesterday. And this is something that I think people are discussing a lot in terms of the dynamics of who would be in government or in terms of administration in Tigray until the next election. Duke, your final thoughts, please.
I think my final thoughts are just that, you know, we're at a point right now with Tigray where we're trying to see what the situation is going to stabilize into. If, you know, I talked about the lack of food getting in. Sullivan talked about a lack of medical supplies getting in. These things are all very serious. we look at the situation with justice and whether or not there's ever going to be accountability, whether or not the E3 Commission will be able to fulfill its mandate, maybe at some point get to visit Tigray, and it's interesting because I think people are still waiting for things to stabilize. More than 100 days after Pretoria, we're still looking at, where are things going to stabilize? And I'm not sure that that's actually going to happen. What Professor Ziegler was talking about with the sort of the spin cycle of media and news stories coming out and everything. These are the types of chaotic things that the Prosperity Party needs to happen to sort of keep them solving problems. It's interesting that the split of the Ethiopian church was used because that was, I remember before, a long time ago, this was his big victory, was to get the Ethiopian church and the diaspora church back together. This is sort of it's like a go-to for him. There's going to be that kind of stuff with Tigray. There's going to be intrigue. There's going to be, local politicians doing things that people don't like, that the diaspora doesn't like. There's going to be the diaspora pushing them to take a harder line that maybe in some cases might be more than what is practically possible. I don't get too far into what should be done at the local level. What local politicians do is up to them. I don't even vote in Tigray. But all of these things will stabilize. They will settle down. They'll calm down, and there'll be an opportunity to build. Right now they're building in Tigray. The civil society organizations are building capacity, are trying to start to roll out some programs on the ground. I know the Tigrayan Relief Fund is putting out grants to try to get things going to the ground. I think we also need to build that kind of capacity when it comes to advocacy, when it comes to transitional justice, when it comes to making sure that there are processes happening that are going to lead to the best chance at accountability that we can get. Because anybody who can stand up here and say there's going to be accountability is trying to sell you something. Nobody knows if there's going to be accountability or not. If there is, it will be after a long and hard fight, or maybe it'll just. I remember the reason why the United States recognizes the Geneva Convention is because Ronald Reagan accidentally went to a Nazi graveyard and had to come back and do a makeup. That's why the United States is compliant with that. These things, it's very difficult to know what's going to have to happen, but everybody needs to stay in the fight to make sure that we get to accountability. Now, I know I don't need to tell anybody whose relatives were the victims of some of these atrocities, these crimes against humanity. They're going to be in the fight, but there needs to be more allies in the United States government. These should be natural allies. People who work in the Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor Bureau of the State Department, they're already supposed to be allies of human rights. People that are compiling the human rights annual report for next year, they're supposed to be allies of human rights. They just need to do their jobs. They don't need to come out and wave a Tigrayan flag all around. They just need to do their jobs. And so people need to stay the course with trying to hold people accountable, trying to push this accountability. And I want to talk to Faisal's point for a moment. The sort of nonviolent movement that this could, this could be more revolutionary than anything that's happened in the past 2 years, if something like that could happen. I remember when I was in Ethiopia before COVID, I was there looking at the movement to get religious freedom for Muslims in Ethiopia, something that they struggled with for a long time. There's a peaceful movement to get that to happen. It took a long time. But steps were made. People moved it in the right direction. It was slow and people were patient, and things happened in the right direction. These things, there needs to be, as much as we want to see stability in Tigray, there needs to be a stability in the advocacy. There needs to be a stability in the accountability measures. and the United States government needs to be stable as far as doing what they're supposed to be doing to hold accountability. That's what needs to happen right now is people need to do their jobs in the United States government, in the humanitarian groups, and that's sadly not happening right now. So there are a lot of things we can do. There are a lot of improvements that can be made. Will those improvements equal justice at some point? Will they equal accountability at some point? There, that's very, very questionable. But these things need to happen.
Great, thank you, Duke, for that, and that finalizes our show today. And it has always been insightful, and many were with us on this live session, and we'll also broadcasting to the Horn of Africa on satellite on Horn Broadcasting Services. Thank you so much, and good night from here. You have been watching the EMD Media's weekly show, H Panel, and we'll be back on a Tigrinya show tomorrow with Solomon Mazgabo, Dr. Solomon Mazgabo, and Getachew Raina from Maqala. And we'll be talking about the current situation in Tigray and the domestic politics in Tigrinya language. Tune to our show tomorrow. Good night. Thank you.